The Oversight Investigations Subcommittee convenes this afternoon to take testimony on the U.S. strategy on Syria. Just weeks ago, our nation commemorated the somber anniversary of the 2001 terrorist attacks. Among the many consequences of that strike on the United States was the increased recognition of the dangers posed by a violent ideology targeting our nation and its allies and partners. Those dangers remain. For decades, the Syrian regime has been known for its barbarity and support for terrorism. But 5 years ago, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria emerged from the remnants of al-Qaeda in Iraq. ISIS killed and pillaged. The goal of ISIS was to develop Syria as a base of operations for a global terrorist network. ISIS has some initial success. The group quickly seized territory, including in eastern Syria. And while the United States continued to speak out against the atrocities of the Syrian government, ISIS posed the possibility of a ruthless anti-American terrorist group controlling a large and important region. Therefore, the United States assisted some of those fighting ISIS. There have been some important victories. Since March of 2017, significant territory has been liberated from ISIS. Nonetheless, it continues to pose a threat. The Department of Defense has declared that ISIS is well positioned to rebuild. ISIS could recapture lost territory. The goal of the United States is to prevent this possibility, but it is essential that our nation carefully calibrate its response. The Syrian situation is extraordinarily complex. Turkey, Iraq, Israel, and Jordan are profoundly affected. The fact that Russia and Iran vigorously support the Assad regime also greatly complicates our efforts. In recent weeks, the administration has suggested that some U.S. military forces will remain in Syria. Furthermore, while Assad, Russia, and Turkey contemplate military activity in and around Idlib around the last week, press reports have discussed how the U.S. might respond if chemical weapons are used again. Today, we will hear more about these topics. We will consider the administration's strategic objectives in Syria and the relevant authorities and resources required to achieve them. We will hear about efforts to achieve a political resolution and the status of U.S. counterterrorism efforts. We will also consider the humanitarian crisis in the region and the reestablishment of governance in areas liberated from ISIS. In a moment, I will turn to Ranking Member Moulton for introductory comments and then introduce today's witnesses, but I want to remind members that this hearing is unclassified, and when we conclude, we will recess briefly and move upstairs to room 2216. And our witnesses will join us there, and we will reconvene for an opportunity to discuss classified information and receive additional details from the witnesses. I will ask members to move promptly to the second location at the appropriate time. And so with this administrative note out of the way, I now recognize Ranking Member Moulton for his introductory comments.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you for scheduling this hearing, for rescheduling the hearing due to the hurricane, and thank you to our witnesses for being here with us this afternoon. Today, we're seeking clarity on the Trump administration's strategies for achieving U.S. political and military objectives in Syria. While long overdue, today's discussion is timely given heightened intervention in the region by the Syrian regime's top allies, Russia and Iran. Just this Monday, the Russian Defense Ministry announced plans to equip Syrian air defense forces with the S-300 anti-missile system, a move characterized by U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton as a, quote, significant escalation, end quote, in the 7-year civil war. In August, Iranian Defense Minister Amir Hatami confirmed Iran's commitment to the Assad regime, affirming Iran would have a, quote, presence, participation, and assistance, end quote, in the reconstruction of Syria. Increasing military escalation by Russia in the Idlib province, which has been temporarily averted by a Russia-Turkey agreement, threatens to exacerbate an already devastating humanitarian crisis, with over 400,000 Syrians dead and over 6 million displaced. My question to the Trump administration is this: what is your strategy? Moreover, we don't even know what your long-term objectives are. I'm alarmed that the president's statements regarding his strategy on Syria have been so overwhelmingly at odds with statements from his senior cabinet officials. Earlier this year, President Trump stated that the United States would be coming out of Syria, quote, like very soon, end quote, and that we should, quote, let other people take care of it now, naively asserting that the ongoing conflicts in Syria and the resulting humanitarian crisis there will no longer be of concern to the United States. In April, after ordering missile strikes in Syria, the president tweeted, quote, mission accomplished, although the accomplishment remains unclear. In an abrupt reversal, of course, senior administration officials recently walked back previous plans of a, quote, imminent pullout of U.S. forces in Syria. Earlier this month, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Nikki Haley warned Russia and Iran of dire consequences if they continue military strikes in Idlib. But what exactly does this mean? This week, John Bolton suggested that the United States envisions a permanent presence in Syria to counter Iran, while Secretary Mattis insisted our forces are only there to counter ISIS. When asked about the inconsistency, Secretary Mattis told press they are on the same sheet of music, but it is clear this is not the case. I'm also disappointed that we will not have an opportunity today to directly engage with the Department of State to examine the administration's plan to support a political settlement in Syria. U.S. Special Representative for Syria, James Jeffrey, recently called for a, quote, major diplomatic offensive. However, specific details have been sparse. Defeating terrorist groups with no long-term plans for political stabilization will only serve to perpetuate the cycle of violence and of repeatedly sending U.S. troops into conflict zones. It troubles me that much of what we have accomplished in Iraq has been undone because we did not have a solid, comprehensive plan to stabilize the region and secure the peace. I will add that this is not about partisan politics. I was equally critical of the previous administration for what I viewed as a lack of clarity in their strategy on Syria. I've met with troops fighting on the ground in Syria and have asked them, earnestly, what they're fighting for, only to find that many of them do not have an answer. It is unfair to our troops to continuously ask them to put their lives on the line without a mission or clear objectives. Although I did not agree with the war in Iraq, at least I knew what the plan was when I went out on patrol at night as a Marine infantry officer. In today's hearing, we will attempt to secure answers to an array of open questions, such as what are the capabilities and activities of our partners in the region, including the U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces. I look forward to hearing what progress, if any, the administration has made towards putting toward a comprehensive strategy on Syria. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. So I'm pleased to introduce our witnesses. We have Mr. Robert Story Karem. He's the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, and U.S. Marine Corps Brigadier General Scott Benedict. He's the Deputy Director of Politico-Military Affairs for the Middle East with the Joint Staff. So, Mr. Karem, we'll begin with you.
Thank you. Chairwoman Hartzler, Ranking Member Moulton, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting us to participate in this hearing today. Because the hearing is open, I will not be able to discuss many of the details of our military operations in Syria, as doing so could undermine these operations and put our forces at risk. We will be very happy to discuss some of these issues in closed session, but must err on the side of caution to avoid disclosing classified information about our sensitive activities in this setting. The U.S. government's objectives in Syria remain unchanged. In Syria, the United States seeks to secure the enduring defeat of ISIS and al-Qaeda and its affiliates, deter the use of chemical weapons, and counter Iran's malign, destabilizing influence. The United States also seeks a peaceful resolution of the multifaceted conflict in Syria in a manner that protects U.S. interests, preserves a favorable regional balance of power, protects our allies and partners, and alleviates human suffering. The Defense Department's role in Syria is limited. We are pursuing the enduring defeat of ISIS with a relatively small U.S. military footprint and a by, with, and through strategy that relies on local partners. While we are not intervening in the Syrian civil war because our combat operations target ISIS, this underlying conflict inevitably affects our efforts. The Assad regime, with Russian and Iranian backing, has retaken significant swaths of territory from the moderate Syrian opposition, which it subjects to violent repression. This behavior imperils international efforts to facilitate an enduring, peaceful resolution to the underlying conflict. Although our military efforts and those of our local vetted partners have hastened the territorial defeat of ISIS and advanced U.S. national security interests, we believe that broader U.S. objectives are most effectively pursued through a negotiated political resolution of the Syrian conflict and humanitarian crisis, consistent with UN Security Council Resolution 2254. As we have previously emphasized, we look to our colleagues at the State Department to work in parallel with the United Nations and our international partners to forge a lasting settlement of the Syrian conflict that includes full representation for all Syrians, including the people of northeast Syria now recovering from ISIS occupation. The U.S. government remains committed to the critical diplomatic efforts underway to end the war on terms that protect the rights of Syria's people and enable the safe, voluntary, and dignified return of internally displaced persons and refugees to their homes. The recent appointments of Ambassador Jim Jeffrey as the State Department's Special Representative for Syria Engagement and Joel Rayburn as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Levant highlight the renewed focus on diplomatic engagement. The Defense Department is eager to support their critical efforts. In close coordination with and under the authorities granted by the Congress, the Defense Department has made significant progress since 2014, when ISIS swept across Iraq and Syria and terrorized hundreds of thousands of civilians. My staff briefs the HASC subcommittee staff, the committee staff, on our activities on a regular basis, and we appreciate these opportunities to solicit input and feedback from the committee as we work through these difficult and complex challenges. As you know, coalition-backed efforts have contributed to the liberation of more than 99% of the territory and more than 7.5 million people from ISIS control in Iraq and Syria. Despite this progress, we assess that even after the defeat of the physical caliphate, ISIS remains stronger now than its predecessor, al-Qaeda in Iraq, was when the United States withdrew from Iraq in 2011. Tough fighting remains in the lower reaches of the Middle Euphrates River Valley, and our hard-won gains in Iraq and Syria remain vulnerable. The enemy is adaptive. Even though offensive operations against the last pocket of ISIS-held territory in Syria are underway, ISIS has begun its transition into an underground insurgency. A sustained, conditions-based U.S. presence will enable us to pressure the terrorist insurgency and prevent ISIS's resurgence, while simultaneously facilitating diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict. We seek to avoid telling the enemy when we will withdraw or leaving before the job is done. We do not want to repeat the mistakes that created the conditions for ISIS's emergence in the first place. We are not alone. We are working by, with, and through a range of partners to defeat ISIS. In Syria, we are vetting, training, and equipping local Syrian forces, such as the multi-ethnic Syrian Democratic Forces, who are leading combat operations against remaining ISIS holdouts. We are also supported vetted internal security forces drawn from local populations to hold and secure ISIS-liberated territory. The 79-member global coalition to defeat ISIS remains committed to the challenges in both Syria and Iraq, and is adaptive to ISIS's evolving ambitions and tactics. Our allies and partners are increasingly sharing the burden for ongoing defeat ISIS operations, stabilization, and humanitarian assistance. Since April, the United States government has secured approximately $785 million in contributions committed from coalition partners to UNDP's funding facility for stabilization efforts in areas liberated from ISIS in northeast Syria, including 70 million euros from France, $18.6 million from the United Kingdom, and 10 million euros from Germany towards explosive remnants clearance, plus 235 million euros in humanitarian support from Germany. We applaud these contributions and encourage our partners to seek additional ways to step up their support for stabilization and diplomatic efforts to ensure a safe and stable Syria. In eastern Syria, the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, and the State Department are leading early recovery and stabilization efforts designed to consolidate military gains and stabilize liberated areas. With support from DoD, State and USAID are addressing humanitarian needs, removing ISIS-placed mines and IEDs, supporting local early recovery efforts, and helping establish the security, economic, and political conditions that will allow for the safe and voluntary return of displaced Syrians to their homes. The ability to co-deploy State Department and USAID civilians next to our military forces to plan and monitor these activities alongside local partners remains a key aspect of our success. In northern Syria, the United States is working with our NATO coalition partner, Turkey, to ensure stability and security in the region. We remain committed to a sustainable arrangement in Manbij that ensures continued stability and addresses Turkish concerns. The United States is working with Turkey to promote local governance and security elements acceptable to all parties, including the people of Manbij. We respect Turkey's legitimate national security concerns and are aligned in seeking an end to the Syrian conflict in accordance with UN Security Council Resolution 2254 that respects the rights of all Syria's citizens and addresses the humanitarian crisis caused by this conflict. We welcome recent reports of a Turkish-Russian agreement to form a demilitarized zone in Idlib, but nevertheless remain gravely concerned over the potential for a major military offensive by the Syrian regime, backed by Russia and Iran, that could increase the prospect for the use of chemical weapons and put civilians at grave risk. Turkey shares these concerns. It remains to be seen whether Turkey's efforts to dissuade Russia from supporting a major regime offensive will hold. And we note that previous ceasefire agreements have been used as an opportunity for Russia, Iran, and the Syrian regime to rest, refit, and resume an offensive whenever it suits them. Putin's continued support for the regime and willingness to partner with Iran in Syria reveals the stark divergences between Turkish and Russian objectives in Syria. A regime offensive in Idlib would represent a dangerous escalation of the conflict and will threaten, not facilitate, diplomatic efforts to end the conflict. Our position on the Syrian regime's use of chemical weapons remains unchanged. As we have demonstrated, we will respond swiftly and appropriately to further use of chemical weapons by the Syrian regime to defend the international prohibition against the use of such weapons and to deter further use. We urge the regime and its Russian sponsors to refrain from using chemical weapons or risk the international consequences of doing so. Our resolve is shared by the United Kingdom and France, and we encourage other international partners to join our diplomatic and political efforts to deter Bashar al-Assad from using these weapons. We continue to support international efforts to attribute responsibility for chemical weapons use, namely the decision taken by the Conference of States parties to the Chemical Weapons Convention to establish a new arrangement to identify perpetrators of chemical weapons attacks in Syria. This decision counters Russia's repeated use of its veto power at the United Nations Security Council to dismantle the impartial UN and Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons Joint Investigative Mechanism, which found the Assad regime responsible for chemical weapons attacks 4 times, including the April 2017 chemical weapons attack in Khan Shaykhun that killed and injured hundreds of civilians. We remained concerned by Iran's significant military, paramilitary, and proxy involvement in Syria. Iran's introduction of sophisticated military equipment into Syria, along with the entrenched Iranian and Hezbollah presence there, directly threatens important partners like Israel and Jordan and risks dangerously escalating the tensions in the region. Iran is also no friend of the Syrian people, and if its behavior in Iraq is any indication, its militia proxies and aggressive agenda will only further marginalize Syria's Sunni population, inflame tensions, and sow seeds of further radicalism. Despite these challenges, the United States is taking steps to strengthen our partners and create opportunities to counter Iran's destabilizing activities. We are working closely with the Department of State to expose Iran's regional destabilizing influence through the Iran Material Display, where representatives from over 66 nations have viewed Iran's proliferation of advanced conventional weapons. We continue to shore up the defenses of our Israeli and Gulf Arab partners while working to improve their military defense capabilities against a range of Iranian threats. We continue to take steps to reinforce vulnerable and fragile regional partners. We maintain a regional force posture and military plans designed to deter and, if necessary, respond to aggression. We are not seeking war with Iran. That said, we will take steps to defend ourselves and work with regional and global partners and allies to address the full range of Iran's destabilizing and malign activities. DoD's engagement with Russia in Syria remains focused on military deconfliction efforts, conducted via military channels, to prevent miscalculations and accidents involving our respective forces, which operate in close proximity on the ground and in the air. Although this tactical deconfliction has been a success, unfortunately, Russia's overall behavior has been at odds with our core objectives. Russia has enabled Assad's use of chemical weapons and continues to hamper efforts to achieve a lasting political settlement to the conflict. Russia has recently launched a concerted disinformation effort, a campaign to discredit the United States and our international partners, flooding the media with fake stories to sow doubt and confusion about the reality of the situation in Syria and to hide Russia's role in the Assad regime's campaign of murder and brutality. The United States is working with its partners across the world to expose and counter Russia's propaganda and disinformation campaigns. Finally, let me just thank the Congress for your advice, funding, and the authorities provided to the Department of Defense in this endeavor. Although the scope of our military activities and our mandate is narrow, we have together dealt with the scourge of ISIS and will together do right by our troops in ensuring its enduring and lasting defeat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Karem. And now we'll turn to General Benedict.
Chairwoman Hartzler, Ranking Member Moulton, and distinguished members of the committee, good afternoon, and thank you for the introduction earlier. I'm Brigadier General Benedict from the Joint Staff Middle East Directorate, and I appreciate the opportunity to take your questions regarding our aspects of our operations in Syria.
Thank you very much. I would like to start, before we get into specific questions, that we have a map here in front of us, and I appreciate that. Could you kind of go over with us what things you would like to point out about this map? Are you aware of the map?
I don't know that either of us have seen the map.
Oh, okay.
I've seen the map. I had it on the placemat for the secure setting, but I think I can tell you just from having looked at that map quite often, I think a couple key points on there would be down in the lower portion. There's an area called Atamf. You see sort of a half circle on the border between Jordan and Syria. Yes, ma'am, in blue there. That's an area where we've got a U.S. presence with a partner force. And then you've also got an area that's shaded up in the northeast. That's orange. That's the area where we partner with the SDF forces. And you'll see down in the lower right, that's an area down close to the border with Al-Qaim and Abu Kamal. That is sort of the final portion of the MERV where the physical caliphate has shrunk, that tiny little orange sliver. You've probably seen maps earlier where the caliphate spread much over Iraq into Syria all the way down towards the Baghdad area. That's all that's left is that tiny orange portion. And then if you go up to the top of the map, the brown area, that is the area in the vicinity of Manbij. The green area located there is Idlib. I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to talk about a few of these places today.
Okay. Appreciate that. So, Mr. Karem, while speaking about U.S. policy in Syria recently, Ambassador Jim Jeffrey stated that reducing and ultimately eliminating Iran's military presence in Syria is a primary U.S. objective. Can you confirm it is a primary U.S. objective to reduce and eliminate Iran's military presence, and expound on what our troops are doing to carry out this mission?
So I think Ambassador Jeffrey, Ambassador Bolton, and other senior administration officials have spoken at length about how concerned we are about the threat that Iran poses to the region and how destabilizing its activities inside Syria have been. It is clearly a high priority of the United States to counter Iran's malign activities throughout the region, including in Syria. I would disaggregate, however, our overall U.S. policy objectives from our military activities. Our military operations in Syria are squarely focused, because of the authorities we have been provided, against ISIS and al-Qaeda. It is, of course, the case that our presence in Syria, our military presence, has residual benefits. Benefits for our diplomats who are trying to seek a negotiated end to the conflict, and residual benefits because it can help deter activities from other adversaries. But the purpose of our military operations, the object of our military operations, is very squarely focused on the ISIS fight. I think that I would also note that just analytically, Iran's presence and malign activities make it increasingly unlikely that we will see an enduring political solution to the crisis. We believe such a political solution is going to be necessary to achieve the conditions that will allow us to secure an enduring defeat of ISIS, to prevent the resurgence of ISIS or another similar terrorist organization.
That's concerning, that comment right there. In your testimony, you said that we're working closely with the Department of State to expose Iran's regional destabilizing influence through our Iranian material display. Can you explain a little bit more what that entails?
Sure, and we at Bolling Air Force Base, or Joint Base Bolling, we have set up a display of material captured from a number of battlefields that our partners have provided us to help explain and expose the types of activities Iran is engaged in. Would very much welcome members of Congress coming out to see this display. We've brought a number of representatives from countries around the world. We think this helps to demonstrate the very activities that we seek international diplomatic support to contest. Violations of UN Security Council resolutions that these weapons and material, I think, really bring home.
So based on your statement a minute ago, you're saying basically, and maybe General Benedict can answer this, that the Department of Defense doesn't have any role really other than just ancillary to countering Iran and Syria. You're just solely focused on ISIS, or is there anything that you're doing as a DoD role regarding Iran?
In Syria, Chairwoman, our role is to defeat ISIS. That's it. And as Mr. Karem mentioned, there is a secondary benefit to our presence on the ground there. Certainly, being on the ground and creating stabilized situation limits the freedom of maneuver of anybody who's got malign activities. That includes Iranian proxies as well as some of the violent extremists.
Great. So what are the administration's current counterterrorism objectives in Syria?
Our principal primary counterterrorism objectives are to secure the enduring defeat of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other associated terrorist groups. And I can talk a bit in closed session about some of the specific activities, but this involves both U.S. unilateral activities as well as the support to local partners who are doing much of the fighting on the ground to retake territory from these organizations and to kill and capture ISIS fighters.
Okay. How will you measure the destruction of ISIS besides just how much territory the group controls? Because obviously now that doesn't control very much. So how are you measuring their impact?
So there are a range of metrics that we would look at, and it's not just a job for the Department of Defense, but for the intelligence communities and the whole of government. I mean, I think we have looked at the territory they control, the assets that they have, the number of fighters and supporters, their freedom of movement, the extent to which their ideology and strategic communications resonate both within local populations and across the region, and other more ambiguous factors. But in terms of the sheer numbers, as I said, we do measure their strength as still being fairly significant.
And last question I have here before I go to Ranking Member Moulton. Does the administration have a plan to prevent the reemergence of ISIS?
The United States military objectives are designed to destroy the physical caliphate and to set the conditions for a diplomatic solution, an economic solution, and social solutions that will allow for the enduring defeat of ISIS and to prevent its resurgence. The military can only play one part in that equation, which is why we're so encouraged by the renewed diplomatic offensive from Ambassador Jim Jeffrey. But ultimately, this will require our partners joining us, and it will require the Russians, the Iranians, and the Syrian regime being willing to sit down at the table with members of the Syrian opposition to bring about an end to the conflict in a manner that creates more stable, more respectful conditions for Syria's people.
Very good. Ranking Member Moulton.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And just to emphasize how bipartisan this hearing is and our concerns are with regards to what's going on in Syria, many of your questions are written right down here on my list of questions. So we share We did not share notes prior to the hearing, but we have a lot of common concerns. Mr. Karem, I was wondering if you could answer, does the 2001 and 2002 AUMF authorizations for the use of military force allow operations against Iran?
The 2001 AUMF is quite clear that applies to al-Qaeda and associated groups, and the 2002 AUMF has been focused on Iran. We are not conducting operations against Iran, have not been asked to conduct operations against Iran. That said, I would note that wherever we are in the world, our military forces have the right to self-defense in the event that we are attacked. But under none of those AUMFs are we envisioning or conducting operations against Iran.
Right, and that seems consistent with what Secretary Mattis said when he stated quite unequivocally that, quote, right now our troops inside Syria are there for one purpose, and that's under the UN authorization about defeating ISIS. That has nothing to do with Iran. He's made that very clear. Now, you said in the answer to the previous question, we have to disaggregate our overall strategy, which includes countering Iran's influence in the region, from our military presence on the ground. Is that correct?
And I think I was making the point that I think we need to disaggregate legal authorities questions, and that there are many tools we use to contest Iran across the region. There are aspects of our military operations or presence that can be useful in countering Iran, but we are not conducting military operations against Iran, is the point I was trying to make. So, as General Benedict and I have said, our presence in certain places can constrain Iran's freedom of maneuver. It can empower our diplomats to put more pressure on Iran, but our purpose in being there and our military operations are not being conducted per se against Iran.
So if we're going to counter Iran, and we have an authorization to do so, we might have operations against Iran, or we might simply have troops in the region. But either actually requires an authorization. I mean, if we're gonna conduct operations against North Korea, we're gonna get a correct congressional authorization to do so before we send troops into North Korea. Correct?
I mean, I would defer to the lawyers as to the precise mechanics.
Well, you're the best we got for lawyers right now.
Yeah.
We're asking you the questions. Because the problem is that National Security Advisor John Bolton stated that the United States intends to keep an indefinite military presence in Syria until Iran withdraws its forces. Now, that, to me, sounds like we're sending our military to Syria to counter Iran, especially because their withdrawal is apparently dependent on actions of Iran, not actions of ISIS or the defeat of ISIS. It's dependent on the withdrawal of Iranian forces, not on the defeat of ISIS or the withdrawal of ISIS troops or operatives from the area. That's what the National Security Advisor has stated.
Congressman, the guidance we have been given is that we have a conditions-based approach in Syria, and that our presence is focused on the enduring defeat of ISIS. But
that's not what the National Security Advisor said. He said that the military presence will last in Syria until Iran withdraws its forces. That, to me, sounds like an operation against Iran, which you've just stated is not allowed under the authorization for use of military force.
Congressman, I think if we were conducting operations against Iran, that would be the case. But we are not. I think what the National Security Advisor and others recognize is that as long as Iran continues to pose a threat, as long as Iran continues to engage in destabilizing activities, as long as it continues to foment sectarianism in Syria, it's going to be very difficult to end this war.
So just to be clear,
until that happens, it's going to be very difficult for us to secure the conditions to allow for the enduring defeat of ISIS.
So, Mr. Karem, just to be clear, what you're stating is that sending U.S. troops to Syria as part of a strategy to deter Iran, and with the guidance that they will not be withdrawn until Iran withdraws its forces, is not a military operation against Iran. If I go and ask those troops, your mission is to stay here and deter Iran until Iran leaves, they would say, yes, that's our mission. We are not operating against Iran. We're not here as part of a strategy against Iran because, of course, that would be illegal.
Congressman, our forces were sent to Syria to defeat ISIS. It is true that there is a
Then why is their withdrawal, according to the National Security Advisor, dependent on Iran withdrawing its forces?
I think he's making the analytical judgment that...
This is not an analytical judgment. You're telling troops when they can go home. You're telling the parents of these troops when they can come home. You know, if your son or daughter was in Syria right now, and the National Security Advisor said, your daughter can come home when Iran leaves, seems to me that's pretty dependent on Iran.
Congressman, the guidance we have been given is that we are there to bring about the enduring defeat of ISIS. We are proud of the progress that we have made, but we understand that there is a tough fight ahead and that the diplomatic effort is going to end up being predominant.
Well, the National Security Advisor has given you different guidance. And if that's what the troops are hearing, if that's what the American parents and families of these troops are hearing, and you've already said that that is illegal under the authorization given from Congress, then I think the administration's got a big problem. I yield back.
Chairman yields back. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Thank you both for being here. General, that map you had, at one point in time there was a particularly significant humanitarian wreck at Tanaf. I may be mispronouncing it. Are those folks still there, and can you give us any kind of an update? You said we have people there. Can you give us an update on what the humanitarian refugee issue looks like in that enclave?
Sir, I believe you're referring to the Rukban camp. There's about 50,000 IDPs, internally displaced persons, in the Rukban camp.
Are the Syrians allowing humanitarian effort coming in from the...
They are not.
They're not?
They are not.
And so the Jordanians are still, in effect, crane lifting across that line the humanitarian supplies that are getting in there?
The Jordanians are providing limited assistance to them.
Has the regime explained why they're making their own people suffer like that?
Sir, we don't talk directly to the regime about it, but no, there hasn't been an explanation of why they have not allowed the humanitarian corridor to open from Damascus to Rukban.
That's a pretty rugged part of the world. Temperatures, it's a desert. Would it be fair to say that those refugees, those Syrian internally displaced folks, are under some stress and misery?
I certainly agree with you. That's a rough part of the rough area to live in, and so I imagine that the conditions there would not be
ideal.
Very good.
So, does the regime led by Assad have the capacity and the wherewithal to actually send humanitarian relief there if they so mind, if they were of such a mind?
We definitely believe that they do have the capacity.
So there's no physical barriers, there's no blocking forces, there's no issue why they wouldn't do that other than that he just doesn't care about his people?
The U.S. military hadn't provided any inhibition for them providing that.
And you're not aware of any other outside forces between there and Damascus that would physically prevent humanitarian aid getting there? A bit rhetorical, but so in the southwest corner, our allies with Israel and Jordan have said no Iranians in that area. Can you tell if the Iranians are abiding by that?
Congressman, I think we'd be happy to talk in closed session about what we see in southwest Syria. They are both clearly very concerned about the threat that would be posed by an Iranian residual presence in southwest Syria. They have sought to secure the departure of Iranian forces through negotiations with the Russians. We do not have a presence in that part of Syria, but
our allies do.
Our allies.
They live there?
They are not present on the ground in Syria. The regime
I know, but they're right across the line.
The regime now controls that territory.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen. You go back. You get a second bite at the apple before the rest of us go?
I get a second bite of the apple, apparently, because the other members here are not on the subcommittee.
All right. Recognize Seth for an additional 6 weeks.
I'll be brief. Just one question. What kind of political end state for Syria does the administration envision? How does our military presence support that goal?
So I would refer you to Ambassador Jeffrey and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Rayburn to articulate sort of the specific diplomatic strategy and end state they envision. They have talked about it consistent with the plan or the framework outlined by UN Security Council Resolution 2254, and a process that is inclusive of all of Syrians and allows for full participation. So I would defer you.
Here's the key question: like when I'm go to the Middle East and talk to troops, they're going into Syria, and I say, "Hey, what is your mission? What are you trying to achieve?" And my experience is they'll say, "Well, we're trying to take this town back from ISIS. We're trying to take this village." And I'll say, "Okay, well then, what happens next?" In other words, that's your immediate tactical mission. But what is the objective that you're trying to achieve? Who's going to take over? I mean, a lot of people disagreed with the war in Iraq, but it was very clear what we were doing. We were taking territory back from al-Qaeda or from other insurgent groups, from militias or whatever, and we were handing it over to the government of Iraq. There was a very clear political objective to our strategy. You might have disagreed with it, but at least we knew what we were trying to achieve. What is that political objective in Syria, in the language that us here on the committee and that most importantly the troops on the ground can understand?
So I think General Benedict and I have spent a good deal of time talking with some of our forces who are out there, and I think they do have an appreciation of what we are trying to accomplish. They also have a better appreciation, I think, than we often do of how difficult this is. And there are these immediate tactical objectives. Retaking the next town from ISIS. There is the longer-term objective that is tactical but blends into the strategic in terms of setting up governance and stabilizing liberated areas in northeast Syria.
Governance by whom?
Pardon?
Governance by whom?
Governance by locals. And what our military has been facilitating in conjunction with Start Forward and international partners has been using the Syrian Democratic Forces, an increasing Arab percentage of them, to ensure that the towns that have been liberated by ISIS, that security and governance is provided by locals, that the governance structures that are put in place are responsive to and comprised and representative of local populations.
So we're trying to create...
All of that, though, is then sort of fed into this larger political process, which we don't control, but we support. And that is about how do we put diplomatic pressure on the regime and the Russians to allow for a diplomatic process that is inclusive of all of Syria's opposition and can resolve the conflict.
So that's the answer the troops would give.
I think they would see the immediate objective of liberating towns and a vast swath of Syria from ISIS. And I think they would see a connection to the need for a political end state so that the hard-won military fight that our partners have been leading isn't for naught, that Iran and the regime doesn't simply plunge across the river and take back and repress these same villages from which ISIS sprung in the first place.
So essentially what you're saying is that we're going to have local control of all these different villages that we tactically take back, sort of like recreating medieval Europe in Syria. And we don't know what's going to happen with the big picture. We don't know who's going to control the government. The national leadership of Syria is totally up for grabs. We don't have any idea what's happening there, or even what our goal or objective would be in determining that strategy.
Congressman, I think it's similar to your experience in Iraq, where we were trying to help Iraqis take back their towns. The difference is, however, this is taking place in a different kind of conflict, with a civil war that is raging. And we are not prepared to simply abandon our partners to the Assad regime. And so we are not seeking to create a independent country. We want to use the hard-won military victories of the Syrian Democratic Forces as leverage towards a diplomatic end state. We cannot promise what that will look like, but our presence will help these communities have a better shot at securing political negotiation.
General Benedict, is there anything you'd like to add to that from the military perspective, from the troops on the ground in terms of what they're trying to achieve?
Yes, thank you. So I was just in Raqqa I guess it was about a month or so ago, and really no question in my mind that Green Beret battalion commander understood what his mission was, providing stabilization in that area. Also, the forces, of course, who are defeating ISIS, that's a very clear, operational mission that they understand what the intent is. I think the last point that Mr. Karem made, is particularly important. So, the military mission is pretty clear. There was no, at least from my mind, from the lieutenant up to the lieutenant colonel, any question what they were doing there, why they were doing it, and they were seeing the results of what they were doing in the stabilization. And that then can contribute as part of that leverage to eventually get to a political settlement. But no question, lasting defeat of ISIS is their mission. They understand that. That includes that stabilization to set the conditions so ISIS doesn't come back.
General, there's no debate for me that they understand an operational mission. My question is, what is the strategic mission? What are they trying to achieve when they succeed with their operational mission? And just to use the Iraq analogy again, I don't think it's very consistent, because I think in Iraq, we clearly had a strategic goal, a strategic political goal. Remember, we had this big debate. Maybe we should divide Iraq into 3 parts, or maybe we should just have one central government. We resolved that debate. Not everybody agreed with how we resolved it, but we knew what we were trying to do was empower a central government in Iraq. And so that's my question. And I guess your answer, General, is simply that they know that they are creating stability to support some sort of future government.
Well, yes, sir, and as mentioned, the efforts of Ambassador Jeffries to get this back into the Geneva, and part of that process of having the discussions to get the players to the table, our activities and the success that we've had, not only providing for the defeat of ISIS, the most successful operations that are being conducted in Syria against violent extremists, but also the success that we're having locally with setting up, supporting the local governments, supporting the reconstruction, stabilization, return to services. That type of leverage does play into the negotiations that Ambassador Jeffries has to drive towards a political solution. So I believe that they can see through that operational perspective and see the value of the effort that they're doing towards a larger political goal.
General, I recognize that this is a very difficult situation, and in some ways you and your troops are in an impossible position. I think having some clarity on that strategic objective, rather than just sort of creating the conditions for some sort of government, would be helpful to us and also helpful to the troops on the ground. But thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you. Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not sure how much influence we have in the political process in Syria, and I'm pretty sure we have very little, if any, control over it. I do have questions that would not be, you couldn't answer in this setting, that I'll save for the next one. But I do have a question for you, Mr. Secretary. Getting back to the issue of authorization, it seems that because ISIS is in Syria, that is how we justify being authorized to operate in Syria. Is that correct?
That's correct.
How many countries is ISIS in?
Off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you. I think the reality has been that the largest preponderance of ISIS fighters have been contained in Iraq and Syria. It's where they established territorial control. They have operated more under the radar, hiding in populations in other countries. So I think there's a difference in terms of the unique situation we found ourselves in 2014, where ISIS took over what was basically a swath of territory the size of Indiana.
So it is territorial control then that the legality of the authorization is based on, not the fact that ISIS is there?
No, I think it's the territorial control that ISIS had that facilitated or led to certain types of military operations rather than more intelligence or law enforcement activities. We also no longer had governance structures in western Iraq or eastern Syria. We were welcomed into Iraq by the Iraqi government, which explains some of the legal parameters of our operations there. But in Syria, the previous administration and this administration has continued to rely on the 2001 AUMF to conduct its operations. This has been amplified by specific authorities the Congress has provided us to provide support to our local partners, the Syrian Democratic Forces, for example, which is authorized in statute.
So just, I don't think there was ever a win in Syria. I mean, just looking at things, and for the United States, I mean, it was like a kaleidoscope. Every time one thing changed, something else changed. The Russians clearly already had the high ground, and I mean, just looking at the scenario, I want to go back to we're obviously there. We the issue of the legality of us being there is based on ISIS being there, and just hypothetically, if we follow that through, if ISIS is in just a hypothetical number, let's say 20 countries. Do we then have the authorization to go into all of those 20 countries?
I think we would have to take a look case by case at the situation on the ground. What was the capacity of the individual country to take action?
Can I ask you a follow-up on it? When you say we, do you mean Congress or the administration?
The United States writ large, and I think our operations, our activities have been conducted often in large consultation with the Congress. Our efforts to support local governments in fighting ISIS, we can't do without explicit authorities and support from the Congress. Monies that are appropriated for our train and equip efforts, for example, are provided by the Congress and overseen by the Congress.
I think that, respectfully, I think some of that might be debatable. But I am concerned that future administrations, I'm close to this administration, the idea that just because an organization by a certain name is in a country, that gives us the ability to say, well, because they're there, I've got the authorization to go do whatever I want to in that country, and I'm very concerned about the authorizations, and I think it deserves further discussion. But I have some very specific questions, but I'll yield any remainder of time that I have for the next setting.
Thank you for yielding back your 14 seconds. Appreciate that. Representative Gabbard.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, gentlemen. It's been estimated by several sources and confirmed by General Dunford publicly that there's approximately 20 to 30,000 al-Qaeda terrorists and other jihadist terrorists that are holed up and in control of the city of Idlib in Syria. We've recently heard, just in the last several days, threats from your administration of quote-unquote dire consequences for any military offensive by Syria, Russia, or Iran against these al-Qaeda terrorists in Idlib. James Jeffries stated that the U.S. will not tolerate, quote, an attack, period, and that any offensive is to us objectionable as a reckless escalation. So considering the fact that, you know, Mr. Karem, you've noted many times just in this hearing that our troops are in Syria operating under the authorization to use military force that was passed after al-Qaeda attacked us on 9/11, and that we are supposed to be at war with al-Qaeda. My question is, how is it in the national security interest of the United States that rather than going after al-Qaeda and defeating al-Qaeda, the United States is making these threats and essentially acting as the protectors of al-Qaeda in Idlib, in Syria, and these other terrorist groups? How is this not a complete kick in the face and an insult to the American people, all of those lives who were lost on 9/11, first responders, our troops, their families, everyone who has sacrificed so much?
Congresswoman, I would strongly dispute the notion that we are protecting al-Qaeda in Idlib, that we are protecting al-Qaeda in any fashion.
How can you dispute this when all indications, if you follow this path and this trail and the reality, that al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups are in control of Idlib today? and our government has threatened any of these other countries who have talked about attacking these terrorist groups in Idlib. How can you see it in any other fashion?
We'll be happy to talk about some of the dynamics in Idlib in closed session.
Do you dispute those numbers that General Dunford has confirmed publicly?
I think those numbers may refer to a global ISIS number, but there's
He was
no
very
dispute.
specific. He was very specific to say 20 to 30,000 plus Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups in control of Idlib.
There is no dispute that Idlib has become a hornet's nest of multiple terrorist organizations. Regrettably, this is the product of the Russian and regime approach to consolidating control on the ground in Syria. They have used de-escalation zones and local negotiated deals to purge areas in Syria and have used Idlib as a dumping ground, and they have allowed the free transit of the worst terrorists to go to Idlib.
And the fact is, and I've asked this question of many of our other both civilian and military leaders over the last few years, both in the previous administration, this administration, the fact is that the United States government and military has not made a concerted effort to go after Al-Qaeda early on in Syria as they have with ISIS. Before my time has expired, I want to ask about Iran and follow up to some of the questions that were asked earlier with regard to the fact that in Iraq and Syria, Iran has more influence in those two countries today than ever before in recent history. And since it is apparently not in our national security interest to have Iran's influence in that region expanded, would you agree that our policies in these countries have resulted in the exact opposite of what would be in our national security interest, with Iran having a stronger presence there than they did, specifically in Syria prior to 2011?
I'm not sure that I follow that our specific activities are the reason that Iran has more influence.
Prior to our invasion to Iraq, Iran had less influence there than after.
I think
in Syria, prior to 2011, when this war broke out to overthrow the government, and our support for that, along with Saudi Arabia and Qatar and other countries, Iran had far less of a presence and far less influence in Syria than they do today.
Regrettably, Iran's presence and influence in Syria and Lebanon and across the region predates the war.
Would you not agree that they have far more of a presence and influence today than before?
I think their influence in Syria has far more to do with the Syrian civil
I'm just
war
asking a simple
than it
question
does with
about whether or
anything
not
the
they
United
have
States has
more
done in
of
Iraq
a
or
presence
elsewhere.
and influence today than before 2011.
Sure, but it has little to do with our policies so much as it does with the Syrian civil war and the relationship with Bashar al-Assad.
Time's expired. Thank you. Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you. Given that Russia, I'd like to pull the string on the Russia angle a little bit. Given that Russia has leased ports and air bases for, in some cases, 5 decades, and I apologize if this is already covered, to me that suggests this is about far more than just shoring up support for the Assad regime, that Russia has sort of a broader regional play in mind. What is your assessment of Russia's long-term goals and objectives in Syria and in the Eastern Mediterranean?
I think there's a debate in the analytical community about whether Russia does have long-term strategies or relies on short-term tactical improvisation. I would agree that I think they're looking simply beyond just shoring up Bashar al-Assad and are utilizing their newfound influence and presence in Syria for diplomatic leverage and influence to undermine the United States, to project power into the Eastern Mediterranean. We could talk more about some of this in closed session, but I think unquestionable that Russia's intervention in Syria has changed the trajectory of that conflict and very much complicated the situation. Regrettably, at every turn, they have chosen not to be partners in trying to end the conflict through peaceful negotiations, but instead have complicated the political situation on the ground with their full-throated support for the Assad regime and willingness to partner with Iran on the ground.
And I hope in closed session we could dig in deeper to the nature of that partnership, particularly as it pertains to any operational coordination between Russia and terrorist proxies and Hezbollah he's deployed to Syria. But General Benedict, I don't know, to the extent possible in open session, obviously the Russians have deployed S-300s and S-400s to Syria since at least 2006, but in the last few weeks we've heard that S-300s are being transferred to the Assad regime. Can you just give us an assessment of what that means, if anything, for our ability to conduct operations, and by extension, does that place limits on our allies, the Israelis in particular, their ability to conduct operations in and around Syrian airspace?
I think I'd like to take most of the details of the question about both our operations or our partners into the closed session, but I think what I would say is that the introduction of more of these systems in there only serves to create more unstable conditions and the likelihood of miscalculation that such as which we tragically saw earlier in the week with the Russian plane being shot down by the Syrians. So I think that my greatest concern is that the more things that we're putting into this small area, and particularly as we're starting to close in the north part of Syria, the more dangerous the entire situation becomes because of the instability.
We can also see a scenario in which it might limit our options. If, for example, Russian personnel were in an area and we were contemplating taking action, we might be more loath to do so as a result of the introduction of such technology and associated forces necessary to operate it. To just quickly on what my colleague, Mr. Scott, was talking about, the National Security Advisor, Ambassador Bolton, has said that any potential third strike on the Assad regime would be, I think he used the term, qualitatively different in nature, meaning that there would be some sort of escalation of force. If a strike would be of a greater magnitude, qualitatively different, does the administration still intend to rely mostly upon the 2001 AUMF and the sort of grab bag of authorities that you referenced earlier? Or would it be interested in seeking a new authorization for the use of military force in Syria?
I think Secretary Mattis would not want us to opine on hypothetical or operational matters.
But it would be fun to do so right now.
Not fun for me when I got back to the department. I would say that the administration has produced and provided a public Office of Legal Counsel assessment of its legal authorities under which it operated in the April strike that I would refer you to, that speaks at length to the authorities it has to respond to the previous use of chemical weapons.
Well, my concern with the reasoning laid out in that document is that you're placing a lot of weight on the inherent constitutional authority of the Commander-in-Chief to conduct foreign relations. But as everyone knows, I mean, the Constitution vests enormous war declaration and war-making authority in the Congress of the United States. And so I think there are many of us here that would suggest that we have stretched the logic to beyond the bounds of recognition. And I think there's a bipartisan interest in doing something about it. And I recognize fully that ultimately this is not necessarily the fault of the executive branch. Executive branches always tend to aggregate power wherever they can. It's a fault of Congress's unwillingness to do its basic duty. And I've run out of my time. I apologize.
Thank you. Mr. Gallego.
Thank you. Mr. Karem, let's go back to Russia. And I've heard some things that kind of astound me. Russia's goals always seem clear to me, and it has been since the 1800s. Warm water port, make sure you keep Turkey off the sidelines and destabilize their alliances to us, which, by the way, at this point, seems what they got. And what else do they want? And what else do they have before? Is they were propping up a puppet. They still have their puppet. They now will continue to have free access to military bases, which they had before. But more importantly, what they're getting right now is they're tying us down to what seems to me to be a war or operation, whatever you want to call it, that has no end, which eventually just starts sucking away at our resources that we need to take care of the interests that we really care about, which, from what I understand, historically are continued freedom of the seas, continued world rejection of human rights violations, counterterrorism, and defense of Israel. How are we not actually basically falling into the Russian traps by basically continuing to, basically engage in this quagmire without an end, and actually end up rejecting some of these other interests that are extremely important to the United States?
So I think it's regrettable that Russia's behavior in Syria has complicated this conflict and made a political resolution more complicated. But I don't think it's necessarily tied us down. In fact, I think if you compare the success that the United States and its partners have had in defeating ISIS and liberating territories in areas where we have operated in Syria with Russia and the regime's efforts against ISIS and Al-Qaeda, I think we stack up remarkably well. In fact, it's what we're focused on.
We're the furthest separated from Turkey as our NATO ally since the start of this war. They still have the warm water port they had before, and they still have Assad, but at the same time, we are clearly not getting out of there anytime soon, and at the same time also taking our interests off the pause in other areas. On all scopes of this, we're losing right now in terms of protecting our overall interests outside of Syria. That aside, let me just leave that there. Right now, I would also like to ask you another question. The Department is not authorized to fight the Syrian government. Is that correct?
We are not intervening in the Syrian civil war.
Okay, great.
We do not have the authority.
What is being done to ensure that U.S. forces or funds are not being used to engage in hostilities when it comes to the Syrian government, with the Syrian government?
Can you restate the question?
Correct. The Department is not authorized to fight the Syrian government. What is being done to ensure that U.S. forces or funds are not being used to engage in hostilities with Syrian government forces?
So, I think Congress has been fairly explicit with us in terms of how we allocate our funds and the vetting procedures we use with respect to training and equipping, which we report on a regular basis, both the procedures we use to vet as well as the activities of our partners. That's one example of how carefully we adhere to the restrictions the Congress has placed on our authorities in Syria.
And to engage in a hypothetical, if you can, much like Congressman Moulton, I also served in Iraq and played a lot of whack-a-mole all through, actually, Haditha, Al-Qaim, and a lot of the cities actually that are on these maps today. The last thing I want to see is other young men and women playing whack-a-mole indefinitely through the Syrian plains. What is the definition of true defeat against ISIS? If our if our orders are to be there until ISIS is defeated, what does that actually mean in Syria? Because what I'm interpreting as right now is like we may actually defeat ISIS and actually destroy the functional elements of ISIS, but there seems to be this other element where because the idea of ISIS may exist, that is the pretext of why we should stay in Syria when in fact it's just for us to buffer against Iran, which if that's the case, then you should come back to Congress and actually ask for that authorization.
So I think the last thing that we want is to continue simply playing whack-a-mole. And we want to avoid the mistakes that we have made in the past and ensure that what we leave behind in Syria and Iraq means that U.S. servicemen and women aren't going to have to come back and fight an even more dangerous enemy. But this is why the political resolution of the conflict, it's why the political and security developments of the Iraqi government are so important. And it's why we do what we can as the U.S. military to be connected to the State Department activities, whether that's to help the Iraqis develop their security forces and governance capacity, or whether it's to facilitate a political end to this conflict in Syria. We need to see local security forces who are representative of and respectful of the local populations who can keep control. And unfortunately, we don't see an indication that the Assad regime is going to result in that kind of stability.
Okay, well, votes are going to be at 4:45 to 5, and so this is going to conclude the open portion of the afternoon's hearing, and we'll walk upstairs to 2216 for the classified discussion. We'll adjourn for 3 minutes and then promptly reconvene. Thank you very much.
So we're going to classified first, then vote?